Most people think power is loud. They imagine dominance as shouting, fighting, threatening, or proving strength physically. But the most dangerous people in history rarely needed violence to destroy their enemies. Because real power operates psychologically. The strongest attack is the one your target never notices until it's too late. And the terrifying truth is, most psychological wars are invisible. They happen in conversations, silences, social circles, body language, attention, perception. One person walks into a room and controls everyone without raising their voice. Another loses respect without understanding why. Some people can make enemies emotionally collapse while appearing completely calm on the surface. And once you understand dark psychology, you start seeing the hidden battlefield everywhere. At work, in relationships, on social media, inside friendships, even inside families. Because human beings are emotional creatures pretending to be logical. And the people who understand emotion control behavior. Tonight, we're exposing 10 dark psychology tactics used in silent psychological warfare. These are the manipulation methods used by elite negotiators, narcissists, politicians, toxic leaders, Machiavellian personalities, and emotionally dangerous people to dominate others mentally without direct confrontation. But this video is not about becoming evil. It's about becoming aware. Because the moment you understand psychological warfare, you stop becoming easy to manipulate. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how enemies are broken psychologically, why silence terrifies people more than aggression, how emotional control creates invisible dominance, and how to become mentally untouchable in a world full of manipulation. Let's begin. Tactic 1. Strategic absence. One of the most powerful psychological weapons is disappearance. Because humans value what feels unavailable. Most people think winning requires constant presence, constant texting, constant explaining, constant reacting, constant defending. But psychologically, attention creates familiarity, and familiarity lowers emotional impact. Strategic absence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates obsession. This is why people often become more emotionally attached after losing access to someone. The human brain hates unfinished emotional experiences. When you suddenly remove your presence, your enemy's mind starts filling the silence automatically. They begin wondering, why did they disappear? What are they doing now? Did I lose control over them? And the less information they have, the more psychologically consumed they become. This tactic becomes especially powerful when dealing with narcissistic personalities, because narcissists feed on emotional reactions. Attention is emotional fuel. Whether positive or negative doesn't matter. As long as they affect your emotions, they feel psychologically powerful. But strategic absence removes emotional fuel completely. Silence becomes psychological starvation. And the terrifying part? Most people destroy their own power by over-explaining themselves. They announce every move, every emotion, every thought, every plan. Emotionally intelligent people move differently. They understand mystery creates psychological tension. Not because mystery is magical, but because the brain naturally obsesses over incomplete information. That's why silence often feels louder than words. And strategic absence doesn't only work in relationships. It works socially too. People notice energy shifts more than constant presence. If someone expects your attention and suddenly loses access to it, your value increases psychologically, because scarcity creates perceived importance. This is why emotionally detached people often appear powerful, not necessarily because they are superior, but because emotional control creates psychological intrigue. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes your absence reveals people's true intentions faster than your presence ever could. The moment you stop chasing, you discover who actually valued you. Because fake loyalty disappears when convenience disappears. And psychologically weak people panic when they lose emotional control over someone. That panic becomes visible through increased attention, indirect behavior, stalking, gossip, or attempts to provoke reactions. But the key to strategic absence is discipline, not ego. Disappearing emotionally to manipulate others constantly eventually becomes toxic itself. The real power comes from refusing to emotionally perform for people who don't deserve access to you. And once you master emotional restraint, you unlock the next tactic. One of the oldest psychological weapons ever used. Observation. Tactic 2. The cold read. Most people reveal themselves constantly without realizing it. Their fears, their insecurities, their desires, their weaknesses, and the people who pay attention quietly become dangerous. The cold red is the art of making people feel understood while actually gathering psychological information about them. Manipulators use this constantly. They observe patterns carefully, tone shifts, body language, reaction timing, eye movement, emotional triggers, and once someone feels emotionally seen, they lower defenses automatically. Humans trust familiarity. That's why skilled manipulators often mirror personality traits subtly. They make you feel connected quickly. But here's the dangerous part. People desperately want to feel understood, so they often expose themselves emotionally to anyone who creates that illusion. Cold readers ask strategic questions indirectly, not interrogations. Emotionally open-ended statements. Things like, "You seem like someone who's been disappointed a lot. You act confident, but you overthink everything. You don't trust people easily." These statements are broad enough to apply to many people, but emotionally personal enough to trigger disclosure. And once someone starts explaining themselves emotionally, they reveal far more than intended. This tactic becomes powerful because humans naturally seek validation. We correct people when they misunderstand us, and every correction reveals more information. The manipulator listens carefully. Now they understand your emotional blueprint, your insecurities, your emotional needs, your validation triggers, your fears. And information is power, because people can only manipulate emotions they understand. That's why emotionally intelligent people speak less initially and observe more. Silence collects information. Oversharing gives information away. And another terrifying reality is this. People expose themselves most when trying to prove themselves. That's why emotionally reactive people become easy targets. The more emotionally triggered someone becomes, the more predictable they become. And predictability creates vulnerability. This is why psychological warfare always prioritizes observation before action. Because understanding someone's mind is often more powerful than directly attacking them. Once you know what controls their emotions, you control their reactions. And speaking of emotional control, the next tactic weaponizes emotions themselves. Tactic 3. Emotional mirroring. People trust people who feel emotionally similar to them. That's human psychology. We naturally bond with reflections of ourselves, and manipulators exploit this constantly. Emotional mirroring means reflecting someone's emotions, beliefs, energy, or behavior back at them strategically. If they're excited, you match excitement. If they're emotional, you appear emotionally connected. If they're insecure, you subtly validate them. This creates rapid psychological comfort, because familiarity creates trust automatically, and trust lowers defenses. That's why skilled manipulators often seem incredibly charismatic initially. They don't necessarily have strong personalities. They adapt personalities. But emotional mirroring becomes darker when used intentionally in conflict, because reflecting someone's emotional energy back at them amplifies their instability. If someone becomes aggressive and you remain emotionally controlled, their aggression becomes more obvious socially. If someone acts manipulative and you calmly mirror their tactics subtly, they often become psychologically uncomfortable. Why? Because humans dislike seeing their own negative behaviors reflected back. And emotionally reactive people often expose themselves when confronted with emotional neutrality. That's why calmness becomes intimidating. Not because calm people are emotionless, but because emotional discipline creates psychological imbalance for reactive individuals. Most conflicts escalate because both people emotionally react simultaneously. But when one person stays emotionally grounded, the unstable person loses psychological leverage. And another reason mirroring works is because humans unconsciously seek emotional synchronization. We naturally mimic people socially. Speech patterns, posture, energy, expressions. Manipulators accelerate this process deliberately. They create artificial emotional closeness. And the victim mistakes emotional similarity for genuine compatibility. But here's the deeper truth. Emotionally intelligent people don't absorb every emotional atmosphere around them. They choose what energy deserves engagement, because emotional reactions are investments. And the moment you stop emotionally reacting impulsively, you become much harder to control psychologically, which leads to one of the coldest tactics ever used in psychological warfare: emotionless observation. Tactic 4. The dead eyes method. Emotion controls most people. Fear controls them. Validation controls them. Anger controls them. Attention controls them. And psychologically dangerous people understand this deeply. That's why emotional neutrality becomes terrifying. The dead eyes method is the ability to remain emotionally unreadable under pressure. No visible anger, no panic, no emotional leakage, just calm observation. And this unsettles people immediately because humans constantly search for emotional feedback socially. We want reactions. Reactions create certainty, but emotionally unreadable people create uncertainty. And uncertainty makes others uncomfortable, especially manipulative personalities, because manipulators rely heavily on emotional reactions to measure control. If they insult you and you explode emotionally, they feel powerful. If they provoke fear, they feel dominant. But when someone remains emotionally controlled, the manipulator loses psychological direction. Now they become emotionally reactive. This is why interrogators, negotiators, elite leaders, and high-level strategists often display controlled emotional expressions, because emotional discipline communicates psychological stability. And psychologically unstable people often crumble against emotional stillness. Silence forces them to confront their own emotional chaos. But here's something important. The dead eyes method is not about suppressing emotions permanently. It's about controlling emotional expression strategically. There's a difference. Emotionally mature people feel emotions deeply. They simply refuse to become controlled by them publicly. And in modern society, emotional impulsiveness gets rewarded constantly. People react instantly online. Instant anger, instant outrage, instant emotional exposure. But emotionally controlled people understand something powerful. The person who controls the emotional temperature controls the interaction. And calmness under pressure creates invisible authority. Because emotional discipline signals strength subconsciously. Not fake alpha behavior, not loud dominance, real internal control. And once you stop emotionally performing for people, you begin understanding another hidden truth about psychological warfare. Information itself becomes a weapon. Tactic 5. Information control. Most people reveal too much. Their plans, their emotions, their insecurities, their strategies. And every piece of information gives others psychological leverage. Information control is one of the oldest power tactics in history. Because whoever controls information controls perception. And perception controls behavior. That's why psychologically intelligent people speak carefully. Not out of fear, out of awareness. Loose information creates vulnerability. If people know your emotional triggers, they can manipulate you. If people know your plans too early, they can sabotage you. If people know your insecurities, they can weaponize them. And social media has made this problem catastrophic. People broadcast their entire emotional state publicly every day. Their heartbreaks, their frustrations, their loneliness, their jealousy, without realizing they're giving strangers psychological maps directly into their minds. Emotionally dangerous people study these patterns carefully, because emotionally exposed people become predictable, and predictable people become controllable. But information control isn't only about secrecy. It's also about timing, knowing when not to react, knowing when not to explain, knowing when silence protects power. One of the strongest psychological positions is becoming difficult to read emotionally. Not fake mysterious, just emotionally disciplined. Because emotionally impulsive people surrender leverage constantly. And another terrifying reality is this. People often destroy themselves simply because they talk too much. They expose insecurity while trying to appear confident. They reveal emotional desperation while seeking validation. They leak fear accidentally. And manipulators listen carefully. Because information reveals pressure points, and pressure points create control. That's why calm observers often dominate emotionally reactive people silently. They gather information while revealing very little themselves. And once information becomes limited, people begin making assumptions, which leads to the next tactic, turning praise itself into a weapon. Tactic 6. The praise trap. Most people think manipulation only comes through criticism. That's wrong. Some of the most dangerous manipulation comes through compliments. Because praise lowers defenses faster than attacks. Humans crave validation naturally. We all want recognition, approval, importance. And manipulators understand this deeply. The praise trap works by feeding someone's ego strategically until their self-awareness weakens. Compliment their intelligence constantly. Now they need your approval to maintain identity. Compliment their uniqueness. Now they fear losing your admiration. Compliment their potential excessively. Now they emotionally depend on your validation. And once validation becomes addictive, control begins. This is why narcissists often alternate between praise and withdrawal. Because emotional inconsistency strengthens attachment psychologically, people chase lost validation harder than stable validation. And another dangerous aspect of praise manipulation is this. Flattery often blinds people to bad intentions. If someone makes you feel important emotionally, you overlook red flags faster. That's why cult leaders, manipulators, and toxic personalities often begin with admiration, not hostility, because emotionally validated people become easier to influence. And modern society amplifies this dramatically. Likes, followers, attention, external validation. Entire identities now depend on emotional approval from strangers, which makes people psychologically vulnerable to manipulation at massive scale. But emotionally grounded people understand something powerful. Validation feels good, but dependency on validation becomes weakness. The moment your self-worth depends entirely on external approval, you become controllable, and people who desperately need praise become emotionally predictable, which is exactly why selective emotional withdrawal becomes so powerful. Tactic 7. Selective listening. Not every reaction deserves energy. That alone is a superpower. Selective listening means consciously choosing what deserves emotional attention. And psychologically, this becomes devastating because attention itself is value. Most people react to everything. Every insult, every opinion, every provocation. But emotionally disciplined people understand this. Reaction rewards behavior. If someone provokes you successfully, you reinforce their tactics psychologically. That's why selective emotional disengagement becomes powerful. Ignoring strategically creates emotional imbalance, especially for attention-driven personalities. People often reveal emotional insecurity when denied reactions. They escalate behavior, increase provocations, seek emotional validation more aggressively. Because psychologically weak individuals rely heavily on external emotional confirmation. And another truth most people ignore is this. Silence often communicates higher status socially than emotional defensiveness. The more desperate someone becomes to explain themselves emotionally, the weaker they often appear psychologically. Meanwhile, calm restraint creates intrigue, control, mystery, and selective listening also protects mental energy. Because not every conflict deserves participation. Emotionally mature people understand that arguing with emotionally committed chaos usually drains both sides. Sometimes the strongest move is refusing psychological access completely. And once someone realizes they can no longer control your emotional state, they often lose interest entirely. Because manipulation without emotional reaction becomes useless. Which brings us to one of the darkest tactics of all, indirect destruction. Tactic 8. The indirect attack. Direct attacks create resistance. Indirect attacks create confusion. And confusion is psychologically exhausting. This tactic works because humans struggle against invisible opposition. When attacks are indirect, victims often cannot identify the source clearly. Their confidence weakens slowly. Their certainty collapses. And uncertainty creates paranoia. Historically, powerful strategists rarely attacked enemies directly first. They weaken reputation, influence, support systems, mental stability, because psychologically weakened people collapse easier under pressure. Indirect attacks can appear socially subtle. Exclusion, rumors, withheld opportunities, social manipulation, strategic silence. And the terrifying part is, victims often blame themselves initially, because invisible manipulation creates self-doubt. That's why psychologically dangerous people avoid obvious aggression whenever possible. Obvious aggression exposes intent. Subtle manipulation hides it. And hidden manipulation becomes harder to defend against. But here's another powerful truth. Emotionally secure people become far harder to destabilize indirectly. Because self-awareness protects perception, manipulators rely heavily on confusion. The clearer your internal reality becomes, the weaker manipulation becomes. And one of the fastest ways to weaken someone psychologically is isolating them emotionally, which leads to the next tactic. Tactic 9. Social isolation. Humans are social creatures. Connection affects survival psychologically. That's why isolation becomes one of the most effective control tactics ever created. Manipulators often isolate targets slowly, not obviously, subtly. They create distrust between people, increase dependency emotionally, encourage distance from supportive relationships. And once someone loses strong external perspectives, manipulation becomes easier, because isolated people depend more heavily on the manipulator emotionally. This tactic appears constantly in toxic relationships. The manipulator becomes the emotional center of the victim's life. Now every emotion flows through them: approval, attention, validation, belonging. And psychologically, dependency creates vulnerability, because people fear losing their primary emotional connection. That fear creates obedience. And another dangerous reality is this: loneliness changes decision-making dramatically. Emotionally isolated people tolerate behaviors they would normally reject, because humans fear abandonment deeply. That's why emotionally intelligent people protect healthy connections carefully. Strong support systems create psychological stability, and stable people become harder to manipulate, which is exactly why toxic individuals often attack support systems first. But the final tactic is the most dangerous of all, because it requires almost no direct action. It simply lets human psychology destroy itself naturally. Tactic 10, the final move. The most dangerous psychological tactic is making someone self-destruct, because self-destruction feels self-created, not externally forced, and humans resist external control more than internal impulses. Emotionally unstable people often sabotage themselves naturally when triggered correctly. Arrogant people expose themselves through ego. Impulsive people destroy opportunities through impatience. Insecure people reveal weakness through overcompensation. Manipulators understand this deeply. They don't always attack directly. Sometimes they simply create conditions where the target collapses alone, because emotionally reactive people become their own worst enemies eventually. Anger creates mistakes. Desperation creates exposure. Ego creates blindness. And psychologically disciplined people often win simply because they remain controlled while others unravel emotionally. That's the hidden truth behind power. Most people defeat themselves internally long before external defeat arrives. And once you understand emotional triggers, you stop becoming easy to provoke. You stop giving enemies emotional access. You stop reacting impulsively. And suddenly, you become psychologically difficult to control. How to stay mentally untouchable. The goal is not becoming cruel. The goal is becoming aware. Because awareness protects you from manipulation. Mentally untouchable people understand several things deeply. Not every battle deserves engagement. Not every insult deserves response. Not every emotional trigger deserves reaction. And emotionally intelligent people never hand strangers control over their nervous system. That's real power. The strongest person in the room is usually not the loudest. It's the person most in control of themselves. And psychological warfare only works effectively against emotionally unconscious people. The more self-aware you become, the harder you become to manipulate. That means understanding your insecurities, your emotional triggers, your validation needs, your fears. Because people can only weaponize weaknesses you refuse to confront consciously. And another major shift happens when you stop seeking emotional revenge constantly. Revenge consumes energy. Emotional discipline preserves it. Sometimes the greatest psychological victory is becoming emotionally unreachable to toxic people entirely. No reaction, no obsession, no emotional access, just peace. Because true power is not controlling others. It's controlling yourself so completely that nobody else can control you. The world is full of invisible wars. Psychological wars, attention wars, emotional wars, and most people never realize they're fighting until the damage is already done. But now you can see the battlefield clearly. You understand strategic absence, emotional mirroring, information control, selective silence, social isolation, and the hidden psychology behind emotional dominance. But remember this carefully. The smartest people don't use psychology to destroy innocent people. They use it to protect themselves from manipulation. Because once you understand human behavior deeply, you stop reacting emotionally to every provocation. You stop becoming predictable. You stop giving toxic people free access to your mind. And in a world where emotions are constantly manipulated, that awareness becomes a superpower. If this video opened your eyes, subscribe to Dark Mind 999. Because the more you understand psychology, the more dangerous you become to people who rely on manipulation.